Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has warned that the fight for Bakhmut is only increasing. Russian troops have been trying to capture the eastern city for several months. Recently, they have stepped up their assault as they try to encircle it and cut off Ukrainian supply lines. The battle for Bakhmut has seen some of the heaviest fighting in the war, with heavy losses on both sides.
They're fighting for every corner of this nearly destroyed city. Bakhmut has become yet another symbol of Ukraine's resistance against the invaders. Its soldiers have been holding the front line for months, but Russian attacks have become more intense in recent days.
You could say every house and every street is covered in our blood. Our artillery isn't managing to suppress their artillery. We have a lack of ammunition, lack of professional drones that can conduct reconnaissance.
Bakhmut has limited strategic value, but its capture would be a major symbolic victory for the Russian army and the Wagner group of mercenaries, which appear to have put their differences aside.
Essentially, we have seen that, in the political sphere, it seems that Wagner tried to contest the Ministry of Defense. However, as of now, we're seeing that on the battlefield, they're still trying to achieve a common military strategic objective.
Most of the city's nearly 70,000 residents have long left Bakhmut. Soldiers and volunteers are still taking some people to safety. A few choose to stay.
So long as my home is intact, and so long as I'm not hurt, I'm going to stay here.
The scale of the destruction becomes clear when seen from above. But as Bakhmut, known as Artyomovsk during the Soviet times, may be about to be taken over, the city's defenders are trying to keep their spirits high.
I was thinking, maybe I'll turn on the radio and listen to some music so I'm not bored. And on the radio I heard, "Ukrainian soldier, give up. Artyomovsk has been taken by Russians. Leave your positions and surrender. We'll spare you." And I was like, yeah, sure. I'm driving through Bakhmut and I'm going to surrender. So funny.
With resources running low and overwhelming attacks, these soldiers are determined to make the Russians pay a heavy price for Bakhmut.
And for more on this, I am joined now by DW correspondent Amin Esif, who is joining us from Kyiv. Amin, why is the Russian military putting so much effort into gaining control of Bakhmut, given its apparent lack of strategic importance?
Well, the first reason is symbolic. That's because Russia has secured no major battlefield victories since this summer when it took Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. So Russia needs to show to its people and also to the world that it is making advances in Ukraine. Otherwise, it has no way to negotiate an end and secure a permanent victory. And Ukraine obviously wants to keep Russia from securing such a symbolic victory. The second reason is, unfortunately, that this senseless loss of life is a strategy in itself. We've all heard the term a war of attrition metaphorically, but this is what it looks like in real life, with hundreds of people dying every day, according to some reports. Ukraine seems to believe that Russia is losing more soldiers than Ukraine is, and as the head of Ukraine's delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly said himself, that although Bakhmut does not have strategic importance for Ukraine, it believes that it is wearing down Russia's military just by holding out as long as it can there.
I mean, we only have 30 seconds here, but I just wanted to very quickly ask you, there are reports that the U.S. has advised Ukraine to give up Bakhmut because it's not worth the losses. Is that being discussed in Ukraine?
there are some signs that Zelenskyy is listening to his U.S. advisors who have said, don't concentrate on Bakhmut, go to the south where Ukraine has more chances of gaining ground against what Russia has taken there. But this goes back to a fundamental difference in how Ukraine and the U.S. see the war. Inside the Pentagon, they don't believe necessarily that Ukraine can retake all its territory, and Ukraine, they do believe that. So they're fighting to get back all of Ukraine.
DW correspondent Amian Esif in Kyiv, thank you so much.
Let's take a closer look at this with military analyst Mike Martin, who's a senior fellow at King's College London. Welcome back to DW, Mike. Why is Russia putting so much effort into gaining control of Bakhmut, given its apparent lack of strategic importance?
I think there are two reasons that we need to consider. The first one is that this is very much within Putin's stated war aims of, in his words, liberating the Donbass, and he needs to take Bakhmut to complete that task. But the other is, if you look at the way the roads and the rail networks were arranged, there are two bigger settlements to the west of Bakhmut, but still in the Donbass, Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. And in order to take those bigger cities, which he needs to do to complete his strategic goal, he needs to take Bakhmut first.
And I've heard reports, though, that the Americans have been advising Ukraine to give up the fight for Bakhmut because it's not worth the losses. Those must be some tough conversations going on behind the scenes.
Yes, they will. I mean, I haven't heard those reports, but undoubtedly there is a sort of a continual conversation between Americans, Brits, Germans and Ukrainians. I think the one thing I will say on that is that right from the start of this war, the Ukrainians have been in the lead in terms of the goals that they want to achieve in the war, the strategy and the losses that they're willing to take. So I would imagine the Americans can advise them and the Ukrainians will do what they feel that they need to do.
And what sort of size of losses are we talking about in Bakhmut on both sides?
These figures come with a huge caveat. It's very difficult to get accurate figures out of this war. But Russian losses are probably in the range of 20 to 30,000. And that's over the last 6 months whilst they've been trying to take Bakhmut. I'd say Ukrainian losses are probably a half to two-thirds of that. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the different way that the Ukrainians and the Russians use their forces, the Russians are much more wasteful of their manpower than the Ukrainians are.
Right. And we heard in the report that resources are getting scarce, and we've been talking about this in the last months. Can Russia afford to just keep throwing men at this? Well,
personnel is really the one resource that Russia does have quite a lot of. It's running out of artillery shells, as you heard there, and it's running out of some more precision weapons, whereas Ukraine is getting fresh injections of weaponry and ammunition all the time, although indeed for them, even for those guys, it's tight. But yes, Russia can afford to keep throwing men in up until, if you look at the current loss rates, which across the whole battlefield are up to about 800 losses per day for the Russians, they can afford to keep going at this rate of loss until well into the summer.
And Ukraine? Ukraine, you say, has a technical superiority and is using it more effectively. But how long can you keep going on for something that apparently isn't worth it?
I don't think that Ukraine's stopping point in this war is going to be running out of men and women. It's a country of 44 million people, and they are defending their homeland, and it seems to me that the population is behind them. I think the stopping point for this war for the Ukrainians will either be when they win or when the West stops supplying them with weapons.
OK, that's, as ever, very clear. Thank you for that, Mike. Mike Martin from King's College London.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has warned that his country would boycott the Paris 2024 Olympics if Russian and Belarusian athletes are allowed to compete. Dozens of Ukrainian athletes have been killed in Russia's war against Ukraine. DW's Aya Ibrahim went to the western town of Letychiv to meet a woman who lost her younger brother on the front line.
For someone who lived such a short life, Volodymyr Andrushuk left so much behind. a well-looked-after pet cat, a career as a national decathlon champion, and an older sister who will always remember him like this.
He was sociable, friendly, and the best. He had a strong character. He was stubborn. If it weren't for these character traits, he wouldn't be in sports. If it weren't for these character traits, he wouldn't have gone to war.
In late January, Russia's war in Ukraine brought an abrupt end to the 22-year-old's life and his ambition to one day compete in the Olympics. According to Ukraine's foreign minister, Volodymyr is one of more than 200 athletes and coaches who've been killed in the fighting. In light of these deaths and the devastation the war has caused, Ukrainian officials, including here at the Ministry of Sports, have called on the International Olympic Committee to ban Russian and Belarusian athletes from competing in the Paris 2024 Olympics. The International Olympic Committee says it's considering allowing those athletes to compete, but only under neutral flags that don't represent their countries. Neutrality is an illusion when Russia's aim is to destroy Ukraine, says the country's sports minister and head of its Olympic Committee.
If these Russian athletes came out against the war, against the aggression, that would be a sign that they're really neutral, that they don't support what's going on. But if they stay silent, that's implied support.
He showed us this video of a Ukrainian shot put thrower training under shelling, as well as these images that show the scale of destruction of Ukrainian sports facilities. There's also concern that Russian athletes could use the Olympics to taunt Ukrainians. It's something Serhiy Penisenko, a former coach of the national bike motocross team, says Ukrainian athletes have long suffered from. In 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, one of his team members was stopped by a Russian athlete at an international tournament and told this.
He said, "It's pretty cool, we were able to grab Crimea."
We caught up with Serhiy at a Kiev hospital where he was receiving treatment before reporting back to the front lines. After facing Russians on the battlefield, it's hard for him to imagine how they could ever meet again as sportsmen.
How can we stand next to our murderers on a pedestal? How?
A Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman said attempts to squeeze Moscow out of international sport were doomed to fail. The International Olympic Committee insists its mission is to bring the world together in peaceful competition. That mission will now not include Volodymyr Andrushuk.
There was a funeral. We went to the grave. But we still can't believe that this happened to him, that he was given so little, that it was immediate death, that it wasn't an injury, that he didn't get a chance to live.
And for more, let's bring in DW special correspondent Aya Ibrahim, who you saw in that piece. She's just returned from Ukraine. Welcome to you, Aya, and thank you so much for joining us. Tell us a little bit more about these athletes who have been fighting in the war, and especially, how they are reacting and what they have been telling you about this potential ban on Russian athletes. What does it mean to them?
So as the example with Volodymyr, who we saw in the report, these were people that were preparing for careers in sports, and suddenly because of this war and because of the violence that it has unleashed and because of the need to defend Ukraine, they've had to abandon these careers and, join the fight, go to the front lines, whether it's as fighters or whatever else that they were needed to do. And from their perspective, they're losing their careers on the battlefield. So how come as they're, losing their lives sometimes, do, Russian athletes then get to, train in peace, compete, and even win medals at competitions like the Olympics? So that's their perspective in this. Is like, how come that they get to lose not just their careers, but their entire lives? and then their counterparts get to carry on as normal when their government is responsible for the death and destruction going on in Ukraine right now.
And as we've heard, Zelenskyy is now calling for a ban on Russian athletes at the next Olympic Games. Also, we have heard from Poland's sport and tourism minister, who says that up to 40 countries may boycott the Paris Olympics if Russians are indeed allowed to compete. What more do we know about that list?
So we don't have the full list of 40 countries yet. This was indeed a claim by Poland's sports minister. We know that other countries that have been, strong allies of Ukraine in this, like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, the Baltic states, have also, they've had the same calls. And we also have, other Western countries that have also been allies of Ukraine, like the United States, the UK, Japan, Australia, also calling for similar demands. And what we're seeing here, Sarah, is something very, very similar to how support is playing out in the actual battlefield. I mean, we're seeing Western countries supporting Ukrainian demands, but then you have, heavyweights in the region, like China, for example, not really asking for the same thing. If you look at Africa, we don't have countries like South Africa also calling for that ban. So we're seeing like almost a mirroring or a parallel when it comes to sports as in politics.
And the International Olympic Committee, how have they responded?
Well, for them, it's a clear case of discrimination. They don't want, their argument at least is, we don't want to discriminate against athletes because of their passports. A professional athlete's career is very short. They, probably would get to compete in 1 or 2 tournaments within their career. So their argument is they don't want to discriminate. On the other hand, the Ukrainians are saying, well, maybe these athletes should first condemn the war before they're allowed to compete.
Aya Ibrahim joining us with more on the situation in Ukraine, especially how it's now seeping into the world of sports. Thank you.
The war in Ukraine is not just being fought on the battlefield, but there is also an information war that is taking place online. Disinformation has been an issue since before the war began last year. Now, a new item of fake news has gone viral on social media, that the war in Ukraine is a big hoax perpetuated by Western media, Western countries. That's right. They claim that there is no war in Ukraine. The lie is being propagated mainly by right-wing sources, such as this one. Now, this tweet has been viewed 5.3 million times. Did you get that? Since it was posted just 3 days ago. We're not revealing the source, and we've blurred the profane language in the tweet, but the claim that the war is a hoax is based on what the people posting say is a lack of video footage from the front lines. Belén Carrasco-Rodriguez is a senior investigator at the Center for Information Resilience in London. Well, it's good to have you with us. Among the first questions people ask when they see something like this going viral is whether this is coordinated, and if so, who is behind it? I mean, what have you discovered in trying to, provide answers to those questions?
Well, it is a very important question. And I would say that in general terms, there is a significant level of coordination when we look at the spread of Russian disinformation about the full-scale invasion of Ukraine like this one. There is also a component of organic amplification, but there is definitely a significant level of coordination behind things like this. This type of coordination didn't start on 24th February 2022, and techniques aren't much different from before the invasion. So Russia has built over the years solid networks of international proxies that translate Kremlin's narratives into their domestic languages and share them across different social media platforms to amplify the visibility of the content. So these actors launder the information using different techniques to manipulate audiences, such as the artificial amplification via botnets or fake personas. So most of the engagement related to this particular case might be also just like increased by fake accounts, fake personas that are performing cross-platform, and also the creation of bluntly false content like fake letters that we've also been seeing recently around different social media platforms like Twitter or Telegram.
Can we talk about countries in particular that are being targeted most?
Yes, but it is difficult to tell. So, because Russia's information influence efforts are spread globally, and some narratives are more effective in some information environments than others. At the beginning of the full-scale invasion, some countries like the US and most of the European countries demonstrated high levels of resilience to Russian disinformation. So Russian disinformation efforts were more targeted at at regions, at different regions like Asia, Latin America, or the Middle East. However, as the invasion progressed and war fatigue increased, triggered also by the weaponization of narratives like the global energy crisis, European countries became again the target, especially neighboring countries and like countries neighboring Ukraine and those who are hosting higher number of refugees. So it is difficult to tell. It's global, but it has gone through different phases throughout the invasion, I would say.
What is the most successful example of fake news that you've discovered online concerning the war in Ukraine?
I'm not sure if I would say successful, but definitely the most aggressively pushed and harmful false narrative has been the denazification of Ukraine, which Russia has not only used to provide a moral ground to justify the invasion, but also to justify the atrocities committed by Russian soldiers in Ukraine. So so when our team, for example, is investigating human rights abuses and war crimes in Ukraine using open sources, we have come across testimonies of survivors that recall how Russian occupiers claimed that they were looking for Nazis when committing potential war crimes. So definitely, if not the most successful, definitely the most harmful.
I want to show you a tweet that appeared a few days ago. It's a tweet that Belarus announced a Russian early warning aircraft used in the war in Ukraine had been damaged by Belarusian anti-war partisans at an airport near Minsk. Now, there's been no confirmation that this happened. Russia denies that it occurred. The tweet came from an advisor to the Belarusian opposition leader, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Is that an example of disinformation, but this time against Russia?
I'm afraid I haven't investigated myself this particular case, so I cannot speak about it. I have to say that Ukrainian strategic communications have been extremely effective after the full-scale invasion, but they have mainly been focused in sharing real footage of Russian actions on the ground, crimes by Russian soldiers, and disseminating powerful and emotive messages of resilience and defiance of the Ukrainian people.
You know,
but I cannot engage with this particular case, I'm sorry.
That's okay. When you talk about resilience, how much of it comes down to how sophisticated citizens are in a country, how sophisticated they are when it comes to consuming media and news? Is that what we're talking about, levels of sophistication?
Well, yeah, I mean, you could call it sophistication, media literacy, but definitely there's a huge component of how educated in fake news and disinformation the citizens of a particular country that consume like certain content are. So I think that, I mean, like their efforts to increase media literacy in globally. For example, let's say the same social media platforms, right? Like when they are labeling state-affiliated media, they are trying to educate the population about the type of information that they are consuming, and that it might be following like particular ideological line or like a certain particular bias. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, and it's fascinating talking about this with you, Belen Carrasco-Rodriguez with the Center for Information Resilience in London. Please come back, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of reasons to talk again. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you very much.